Good morning. I'm Lloyd Whitman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the launch of our latest report, The Data Divide: How Emerging Technology and Its Stakeholders Can Influence the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Here at the GeoTech Center, we're working to identify and communicate what is required so that emerging technologies can enter use widely across the globe for public benefit while identifying and mitigating potential geopolitical risks. Today we will be discussing data, which in the big data context, one can consider an emerging technology in and of itself. And, of course, data is central to almost every other emerging technology and global issue of concern. To quote from today's report, data is the new oil of the digital economy. But for data to be put to use for maximum benefit, many challenges need to be overcome and risks mitigated, starting with who has access, agency, and control of data. Disparities between sectors and societies over that access, agency, and control, what we'll call the data divide, is the focus of this report and our discussion today. I'm happy to introduce Chris Dagelmeyer from Splunk to start the discussion. Chris is Splunk's first Chief Social Impact Officer, where she's leading Splunk's commitment to using its assets and data to help find solutions to the world's social and environmental challenges. Chris most recently served as CEO of Tides, a global foundation and social venture accelerator, and earlier in her career was the founding executive director of the Stanford Graduate School of Business Center for Social Innovation. Take it away, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Lloyd. And to each and every one of you, excited and honored to be here and appreciate you taking the time out of what we know are really busy schedules for all of us. And I want to start out because my personal journey with data started a couple decades ago. I started my career in the corporate sector, and even at that time, we were able to use data to make better decisions, to find insights of how we were working and meeting our customer needs. I then transitioned to the social entrepreneurship sector. And what I found during that period of my career is kind of an uneven use of data. Worked with some organizations very data forward, others less so. And then, as Lloyd mentioned, I tend to do a little bit of career transition, which gives me unique insights across sectors. Landed at Stanford at the Center for Social Innovation and found myself to just be in data DNA embedded in everything that we do, and was able to witness that power of data around health equity, around improving education, around climate. And therefore, then when I went back, as he mentioned, to the CEO of Tides Foundation, which works globally, predominantly with more on-the-ground organizations and grassroots, what I experienced was a data desert. And we also worked at Tides with the variety of governments around the world, around policy and advocacy, and found that similar lack of data to help them drive the work that they intended to do. Therefore, when I landed at Splunk, which is a security data platform leader, and it works to remove the barriers to data to action, I was able to see again the power of data and how fast it was moving in the 21st century. And if you ask my colleagues, I became a little bit obsessed about what we were seeing as this emerging data divide. And it's really the disparity between the expanding use of data for commercial value and the relatively weak use of data to solve our social and environmental challenges. And while in a pre-COVID world, I would have been running around every room and conference, but I was running around every Zoom trying to talk to anybody and everybody about this emerging data divide. And for each of you out there, I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the 21st century, data is a form of power. Data helps make us smarter. It helps us make better decisions and insights. And we need to ensure that that power of data is not held solely for the highest bidder. And that's why we're all here today. And really thrilled that the Atlantic Council has done this phenomenal report. And we're mobilizing others to come together, because it's going to take government, civil society to address this emerging data divide. And while I'll close just my opening comments with something I think that's really important to think about. We knew 20 years ago that climate was going to impact each and every one of us. And I'm here in California, and we know the fires, and we know the droughts, and we have other people who are dealing with floods right now. We are at this stage now where I think climate was 20 years ago with the data divide. And so we have the opportunity to act now as individuals, as organizations, and as governments to tackle it before the divide continues to grow bigger and be more challenging to tackle with what we're faced with climate change. So I encourage each and every one of you to kind of join us, the Atlantic Council, around tackling this emerging data divide while we're early in this journey. And I feel confident, because I've seen it before. It will help us find solutions to climate. It will help us find, how do we close the gaps around health? How do we bring better education globally? And so with that, again, thrilled to have each and every one of you here, and we'll delve deeply into this great report that Atlantic Council did. And with that, Lloyd, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's really that concept of identifying these kinds of issues that require these kind of multi-sector conversations as early as possible. So to get out ahead of these emerging issues is really what we're all about here. So now I'd like to introduce the authors of the report, Joe Bonneville and Solomon Wise. Joe's a non-resident senior fellow at the GeoTech Center, and when he's not doing thoughtful work for us, he's a subject matter expert with the Department of Defense, where he leads technology incubation and maturation for the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering's Journal of DoD Research and Engineering. Joe has also worked on science and technology and innovation policies at the National Science Foundation and at USAID. Solomon Wise is a program assistant here at the GeoTech Center, where I say he punches above his weight on projects at the intersection of geopolitics and technology. So Joe and Solomon, tell us about your report.
Thank you, Lloyd. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chris, for your words. I think you were spot on with kind of why this is important and why we're here. One of the things that Solomon and I when we first sat down and kind of thought about this problem, we said, okay, we know the data divide is very important, but a lot of people still associate the data divide with the digital divide. And so if you're unfamiliar with the digital divide, it's for lack of better words, it's access to internet devices, right? So we're simplifying it a lot, but access to internet devices and the ability to get on the internet to even look for things, to look for Google searches, to be able to buy things on Amazon, to be able to do digital finance. Any of these things are kind of all focused on the digital divide. As we begin to tackle that digital divide and we bring more people online using wireless communications, using Wi-Fi, using satellites to bring people online, we now have a secondary problem and a secondary effect, which is what we're calling the data divide and access to that data. And as Chris really pointed out, Chris and Lloyd actually pointed out, data is the new oil, right? This is where the money is. This is where the power is. Data affects every day of our lives, right? It affects everything from your credit score and how you're going to be impacted by interest rates, all the way down to simple things as injustice, right? And so, if we have mandatory minimums for sentencing, things of that nature. And so Solomon and I said, okay, we're going to step out. We're going to figure out who are the big players in this game, and we're going to conduct a lot of interviews. I think we've conducted interviews across all fields, government, universities, as well as corporate industry, corporate folks. And we try to really find out what is the data divide to them? How do they see this being impacting them in the future, and how do we move forward with it? And so as we began the beginning of that, as we started to go through, we started to notice a pattern. And that pattern was that there's a data life cycle that goes on for everybody that's collecting data. So there's data generation. We all probably have it on our watches or with our phones as we walk around. We're generating data all day. And so we started to look at, well, what does that mean to us in this data generation format. What are we doing that could be done differently, and how can we make sure that we're encompassing everybody within this data divide to ensure that we're not disenfranchising folks as we move through. After we saw that the data generation portion was obviously important, and I'm not going to give you all of the details because we want you to go and read the report. So I'm going to give you the very much highlighted details. After we discussed the data generation portion and things that we can do to mitigate any type of bias from data generation, we then looked at data capture, which is kind of our secondary portion of the data lifecycle. So actually capturing that data and putting it into a format that is useful for machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence, and things as we move forward to do predictive modeling. So a lot of this data is used to do some type of predictive modeling. That could be for good or it could be for bad, right? And so as we focus on tech for good, we really want to make sure that these models that are predicting things like your credit score, predicting things like your health outcomes, we're making sure that they all have someone that's being used in it, right? So we want to make sure everybody is represented in that data. And so that part is really focused on the data capture. Data processing is, I boxed data processing into a lot of different things. And we did that to simplify the report. If anybody's in machine learning or artificial intelligence and these algorithms, you know that is a large portion of what you do. Between cleaning and processing, that's generally 80% of the lion's share of the work. And we focused on kind of the things that could be done in data processing to kind of reduce those biases and reduce the fact that some of these people are not being included into the data processing forte. And then at the end, we kind of looked at data access. And I think this is kind of the thing that we see every day that is, in my opinion, the most important part of this. Who has access to this data? Because that brings up the privacy concerns. And so we know that government and corporate America have been slammed continuously about their access to this data and what is their privacy concerns. And so we have a large section on that portion just focused on the data access portion. How do we make sure that the right people have the right access at the right time? And then as we move forward, we kind of wrap that whole data lifecycle up and then said, who are the major stakeholders? And so Solomon has taken a deep look into how we can differentiate between government, how we can differentiate between industry and academia, and how those things work. And I won't steal his thunder, so I'm gonna pass it to you, Solomon.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Lloyd and Chris as well for the warm welcome. So in addition to the data lifecycle, as Joe said, we really did a deep dive into 3 key stakeholder groups and how they're affecting the data divide. These stakeholder groups were private sector firms, governments, and civil society organizations. So as Chris mentioned earlier, we see this big trend of the use of data for profit and not so much use of data for social good. And this is very important when the private sector comes in. We see many private sector corporations doing great things and using their data for social good, yet there's still work to be done. We find many examples of data sharing initiatives by corporations, open data initiatives. One very interesting one that we put in the report was a company called galvanizes, a mail order company, which helped locate victims of Hurricane Katrina because their data around addresses was more updated than that of the New Orleans city government. So without this corporation helping out, they really played an integral role in Katrina hurricane relief. In addition to this, we have the government, which plays a dual role. They're both a big capturer and generator of data. As we know, government has a lot of our data. They use it for varying purposes, but they're also the sole arbiter legally of data policy. So they have these 2 contrasting roles when it comes to the data divide. And government can also engage in open data initiatives, share their data, use it for social good. They can also pass legislation that makes corporations more likely to use their data for social good, such as tax incentives. They can also require companies to share data in order to operate in a certain space, and various pieces of legislation like this that allows the government to really incentivize non-government entities to use their data for a socially valuable purpose. Lastly, we have civil society organizations, as many types. You have academia, you have nonprofits, you have advocacy organizations. It's a little bit meta here because we're a civil society organization trying to work on the data divide. But civil society organizations can and have advocate for legislation and actions that will positively affect this data divide and distribute access and control of data through society more equitably. They can help train a new, more inclusive generation of data scientists. They can eliminate biases in AI and machine learning models based on this data. And they can create new data governance structures that facilitate data sharing between corporations and government, between academic institutions and other ones. A very important and interesting one is NetCDF, which allows scientific data to be shared very easily across disciplines, and makes weather data, disease data, all of this much more easily accessible to practitioners and researchers. And with that, I will turn it back over to Lloyd.
Okay. So thanks so much for that little overview we have here. So we're going to move to a panel discussion now with Joe and Chris, who I've already introduced, and we're going to add Michael Scruggs, the Applied Intelligence Lead at Accenture Federal Services. Michael recently joined Accenture to lead a team delivering innovative solutions involving predictive analytics, machine learning, robotic process automation, and edge solutions. He previously served as a senior VP of AI at SAIC and has more than 20 years of experience bringing data science and AI solutions to market. So there's a lot of things to discuss, but I'd like to come back to sort of with the panel to sort of the definition, right? And you know, this concept of the data divide, and maybe talk a little bit more about how it differs from the digital divide and how those two sort of divides sort of intersect.
I'll jump in first.
So go ahead.
I alluded to before, one of the things that we focused on with the digital divide, right? So people oftentimes confuse the two. The digital divide really focuses on access to ICT technologies. So being able to get on the internet, having a cell phone. As we go through the report, one of the things we looked at was how that change has happened over the last 20 years. And how many more people actually have access to these devices to provide an upbringing for themselves and their family. If you look at places in Western Africa where the use of a phone is the only way that they can pay for something, and the only way that they can have access to pay for something, you now see that digital divide is starting to close. But as that digital divide closes, the data divide has grown larger. And the reason of this is because a lot of folks don't understand what they're signing up for, what you click OK to when you're downloading a new app, and how that data is being used for your use and again, as well as against you. You know, so we're focusing on really trying to understand. I think it's a technology understanding problem. It's a technology education problem, and trying to understand what does the data divide do, and how does that focus you on being able to use that data for yourself and for others. And so I'll stop there. I'll let my esteemed colleagues, who we also interviewed, give their responses.
Hey, Joe, Michael here. Yeah, absolutely. The digital divide differs from the data divide, and the way I look at it is the difference between access and representation. And if we think about the promise of AI and machine learning, it's really about trying to get to an n=1 level within your data, and it becomes very important when you're trying to operationalize AI. You want your models to be as specific as possible, so when an individual is represented in the data, the attributes are as close to reality as possible. And I see one element of the divide that occurs in model training data, for example. Historical data being used to identify various trends and patterns in the data. And when that sample or data set leaves out or excludes certain sectors or those in the population, then the model will inherently exclude consideration for those attributes in production data. And as a result, that AI is going to be unable to see me as an individual or the attributes in the data if I'm not represented in that data from a training set perspective. And I think that's how communities in the population become unrepresented, and the outcomes that you're trying to drive with AI are somewhat undermined from a lack of complete data.
And there's even recent, I know, data on image recognition that it still does much more poorly on certain people than others.
Yeah, I'll add just building off that kind of two comments. Or one is really simple. If you think of it, the digital divide was the roads, and data is now the cars and the buses that are growing exponentially. And that is my second point. Why I think now is such a critical time is the exponential growth of data on all of these platforms. And if we don't kind of, again, tackle it now, that historical capture and inequity will be, continued going forward. And then where data is sitting and who has access is continuing to get more and more concentrated, and versus unleashing all that data for social and environmental benefit. So I think, the digital divide was kind of coined in the 90s, and we're still talking about it in 2022, but this data problem is going to grow much more quickly. And therefore the urgency right now to tackle it.
There's actually a little bit of irony in this, because I'm very familiar with the digital divide, and there's actually a significant data divide issue related to the digital divide. Even in the United States, there's actually not particularly comprehensive data on sort of upload and download speeds across the country in different places, and what constitutes broadband, all these things, and there's sort of a data gap there as well. I don't know if anybody else wanted. I think we've heard from everybody on that particular topic. So within this data divide, as we are now talking about it, we have these sort of different parts of the data life cycle: capture, processing, access, and so what are the aspects in those different aspects of the life cycle that we think that are most important to address in the sort of this data divide schema?
So I think at the top, I would say, as I mentioned again earlier, I think data access is probably the highlighted portion, but I'll piggyback, and again, I'm just giving this as a marketing tool. You've got to read the report. But I'll piggyback on the fact that I think what Chris said, data generation and data capture are very important in the fact that, and Michael also said, in the fact that you've got to understand the data that is going in, right? So bad data in is bad data out. And so a lot of the times, if you look at the trained data scientists, the trained machine learning scientists, they come from a very monolithic group, generally white males. And so as we look at the data that they're putting in, a lot of times we're not able to make sure that folks, people of color, women, LGBTQ communities, those folks are not necessarily always included into this data capture and data generation portion. And if we don't include them, then you're missing something when you're trying to get an outcome or prediction at the end. But I still will focus, I still would say the most important part is data access, because that is where privacy is the biggest issue. That is where people of color, been disenfranchised because they don't trust the government with their data, because they don't know what they're doing with it. So as we focus on bringing these things up to par, I think data access is the one that we've got to kind of hone in on and make sure that we're open and transparent with what we're doing as we move forward.
I agree with you, Joe. And as I was reading the report, something that came to mind for me was not necessarily the stages of the data life cycle, but the thought that goes into the outcomes that you're trying to achieve with the data that you have access to, and that's really all around data strategy. And with the advent of this new role in both government and industry, known as the Chief Data Officer, the CDO. Responsible data and AI is bubbling up to be a core work stream in any analytics methodology, and I think it's going to be instrumental in ensuring that it happens across the enterprise. Data generation is really important, and when you see the emergence of advances in smart devices, 5G, and in particular edge computing, where the data and the processing of that data and the analytics of that data happen out in the field, there's a staggering amount of new data that's being generated, as Chris mentioned. And, we have to ask ourselves, are we capturing the appropriate data from these new sources that are bringing just, incredibly new insight into, behavioral aspects, and other things in real time. So, how do we harness that power while at the same time putting the forethought into what we're trying to get out of that data in advance of anybody putting hands on keyboard. And so, formulating a very good, solid, comprehensive data strategy at the outset is becoming very critical in how you apply AI across your enterprise.
I want to build, because I think this is a piece I see a lot, because I have access to a lot of really brilliant engineers and data scientists at Splunk, is what Joe was saying, like garbage in, garbage out, is I think there's also the challenge of getting, unstructured data to being structured that you can actually work and use it. And so when I look at the work that we do a lot with nonprofits, it's really kind of getting that data into a way that can be used in an effective and efficient way to get the insights. And I think that's particularly relevant when we're looking at big government data sets too, is to get, how do you get to that, unstructured to get structured data to be able to use and generate. And so, I agree with the point of we need to make sure everybody's included equitably. And at the same time, I think we've got a lot of data sitting out there and not all of it is as valuable as it could be until we get it to be in a better way to use that.
Yeah, so we have a question in the chat, which is, makes a good point for one of the attendees about, there's also an issue of who interprets the data and how it's used, and that's actually a good framework for another question I was going to ask, related, relatively personally, with each of you have roles in this space, and how does this data divide come out in the work that you're doing, right? And it affects the work. How does it affect the work you're doing, and how does the work Splunk and Accenture and others here in the panel, how does this get personal with you, what you're actually doing at your company and in your job? Chris, I'll start with you, Chris.
Given. So it is, so for our global impact work, it is entirely focused on bridging the data divide to find actual solutions for humanity's greatest challenges. So we're all in on this as a data company, which I do think is an innovative step for a corporation to tackle such a big idea. It's much more common for, corporations to focus on issues of, food, humanitarian, which are all really important, but we were able to kind of say, this is a 20, 50-year problem. Let's jump on it. So what we're doing is a range of things, focusing first and foremost on the field building, because you can't solve a problem until you know what it is, and you're mobilizing people like the Atlantic Council. We're also working with University of Chicago Center for Impact Science, again, continuing to build that awareness and research around the data divide. And then secondly, we also, as we all know, we need more people who are, equipped to be able to use data. So we're doing a lot with workforce development, back to Joe's point, to bring marginalized and people who've been left out of, the tech sector into being engaged from a workforce development standpoint. And then lastly, what we do, we call data to action. And I'm just getting, and so we support with our technology and our talent. It really is about bringing the data scientists also to help the organizations. And I'll just give one example, because it's connects to my experience at Stanford. When I was at Stanford and they were trying to build health globally, a lot in the global South, people were donating all this equipment. And if you've ever been to, Kenya and South Africa, you would go to these community clinics and they'd have a basement full of dead equipment, just dead, like it was given, no maintenance, it broke, nobody knew how to fix it. And Splunk is working with an organization called Help Me See, that we're providing our technology and support. And what they're doing is try to solve the 100 million people who have cataracts that don't have access to surgery by using these simulators. And we're able to monitor it in real time in a proactive way, so those pieces of equipment don't end up in the basement. And so again, I think data in real time will also help in a number of these social areas, building people's capacity to, again, monitor what they're doing as well as their equipment and so forth too. So those are the three areas: field building, workforce development, and what we call data to action.
I think I'll secondary come right behind it. I think one of the things it seems like with Chris and kind of the work that they do, we now call that in the government data for decision making, right? So I think that the person's question and their comment is very spot on. Who is looking at that data to make either a policy decision or a decision on the ground for one of our troops? We try to keep a human in the loop at all times, just as an open statement. We keep a human in the loop at all times, but I think as you look at this data that's being gathered, as you look at this data that's being processed, and a decision being made on that data, it is only a window into kind of, Hans Rosling said this, it's a window into their economy or their world. And so we really need to make those decisions. Chris, that's a great point that you brought up. I spent some time in West Africa when I was doing work at USAID. And if we don't do sense making and understand what the real problem is and what the need is, we can donate, all we want, to a hammer, everything's a nail, but we don't necessarily know what we're doing until you understand what's going on the ground. And so decision making in time decision making is very, very important. So my response to that is, data is made for decision making, but you always keep a human in the loop that has an understanding of what's going on and a 360 type of view.
Any other comments on this? what people are doing? Yeah, the workforce one is interesting. I sort of circle back to that. There's different efforts that are going on in different aspects of education. For example, I know I have friends who are working on the sort of K-12 concepts that to incorporate data science into math curricula. There's comments that people make about, everyone has to take, algebra, but how many people actually use algebra once they graduate high school, unless they're in a very specific STEM fields. And so perhaps we should be, training people on data science, because everyone's going to have to use data. And I don't know if anybody's on this group is involved in those kind of conversations, or have any thoughts on how we expand that talent workforce, starting with the K through 12.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Lloyd. And I think we've talked about how important it is to grow the talent, but I also think that there's a trend in the talent that's coming into the workforce, the new knowledge worker. That's an interesting phenomenon as it relates to the data divide and the digital divide. And that's, people coming out of university, they are looking for opportunities in the workforce that give them not only a way to grow personally and professionally, but also ways to give back to society and promote the social good. And I'm seeing this every day as we are, onboarding new folks from university and graduate schools, that they don't look at their jobs as a way of just making money or getting ahead. They want to be able to give back, and they have this, innate or native philanthropic drive behind them. And as it relates to this process, I think, it's almost going to be, a mandatory requirement that we give avenues in the world of data science to make sure that we're using this power of data and data science and AI to promote social good, as well as, trying to, increase profit in the commercial sector, or, drive sustainability from a government perspective. So I think it's an interesting construct.
Yeah, Lloyd, I'll build on that. I think the K through 12 is an important piece. However, I think it's a lifelong learning piece too. Yeah. And that's, I can speak more, with Splunk, where we focus is really around community colleges and that transition You don't necessarily all need to go to a 4-year college. And so, if we could have data, vocational training, community colleges, I think we'll really also, again, be able to bring in a lot more diverse voices into this field that's really critical right now. And I think also, just back to what you said, every job is, you're in marketing, you're using data. I look at our people, I work a lot with our people department and diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and it's all data driven. And therefore I've got, 2 kids in college or one out currently, and all the jobs that they have an element of, being data involved in how they do their work. And so, the more we can do more quickly, the better off I think we will all be. And yeah, kudos, Michael, agreeing that, the younger generation wants to work for purpose-driven companies.
And I'll piggyback on that as a quick rejoinder. I think one of the things that I'm beginning to notice as I'm getting up in years, K through 12 and those early college folks are really the alpha adopters for all of the new technologies, right? So they're your real alpha and beta testers. And so we've got to make sure that they're trained and understand how to do these things and have a good social impact, so that we can make sure that those folks that understand it better than I will are able to make the right decisions and make decisions for good.
So yeah, it is really important that the workforce and bringing those voices in are the people. That also addresses a lot of the issues of we were talking about of how data is used, and being thoughtful upfront throughout the whole life cycle about equity issues related to data. We've been talking about, we have different groups here. So we have civil society, as Solomon mentioned, in our organization, and corporate and government. And so interesting topic is, what's the best way? How are the different ways these different sectors can work together to bridge the data divide? So where are the real gaps across those sectors that we need to be working better together? Maybe Joe, I'll start with you as the author of the report.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that Solomon and I both kind of saw as a sounding board was that the public-private partnerships need to really have a focus on what the outcome of this partnership is going to be. I think companies are very happy to give you this data if they know what you're going to do with it and how you're going to use it for generally social good, right? So you look at kind of the Facebook and Carnegie Mellon partnership, which when they focused on kind of the COVID testing and going through COVID and trying to understand the health protocols. These are things that Facebook said, okay, we'll give you this data because we know what you're trying to do with it. I think when you start to just ask for all of the data, and a lot of times it's unstructured, as Chris said, so you're not spending a lot of time cleaning it. Companies are, they're going to be reluctant to do that. There's there's personally identifiable information there. There's access problems there. But if you have an outset of what your data strategy is going to be, as Michael mentioned earlier, I think a lot of these companies and a lot of corporations and the government are willing to give their data. I think one of the things, as the last bit, one of the things that we learned and we've heard time and time again during our interviews is, I'm okay with you if you take my data. I'm okay with that, but I want to know why you're taking my data, what you're going to do with it. Nobody said, oh, I don't want the government to have my data, or I don't want this company to have my data. They want to know why you're doing it. And that's kind of one of the big things that we talk about in open trust and making sure that you're responsible with your data and open with what you're using it for.
Or Michael, do you want to go, or I'll jump in, then we'll let.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
So as somebody who has worked at the intersection of business, civil, and society forever, I think there's some pieces, whether you're talking data or any collaboration, you've got to understand the cultural differences. And to me, that has always been one of the challenges of these cross-sector collaborations, is building the dynamics. And so, and it goes all 3 ways. So in business, I can pretty much tell you every quarter our investors want a result. So the mindset that corporations come in is quarterly, quarterly, quarterly. Then you have, civil society. We haven't solved climate. We haven't solved these issues that are on a much longer time frame. And then you have government like, oh, am I in office? Am I out of office? And so what you have to build in is a process that starts with understanding one another and to build those bridges to ensure that collaboration is going to be effective. And I always have found, and I don't know, maybe there's a few cases where this has happened. When you're doing cross-sector collaboration, they usually always take longer than you initially planned. And so why don't we just get smarter about it and plan accordingly? And I think we'll get better outcomes, because back to, again, once you build that trust, that understanding, clarity on what your outcomes are going to be, you can, it does work. So you can get the corporation to say, yeah, we're not going to have outcomes for, 6 months to a year. That's what it's going to take. So I would say the building blocks matter as much as what you want the outcomes to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would just add to that, the process, right? And, setting those expectations early, very important, but then it becomes a matter of what are the use cases? What are the first, problems that we're trying to solve? And if you think about the collaboration across government, industry, and civil society, formulating policies that, can be implemented. How do you allocate funding streams to support the creation of these solutions that are going to address these use cases? And I also think, from another, stakeholder group, and it's, you include it in civil society, but I can't echo enough the importance of including academia in these conversations. You mentioned that the folks in university are still going to be our alpha testers, but they're also a huge source of data generators and in data generation in new forms. And so, using them as areas of, testing and also bringing them to the forefront of the conversation, I think is going to be hugely important. So, maybe a little bit greater emphasis on academia with an eye towards what the outcome is that we're trying to drive. And let's make sure the policies support that and the funding streams support that from a practical standpoint.
So I'm going to jump in with two different hats. One from the GeoTech Center. So one of the things we've been actually looking at is setting up flexible frameworks for nonprofits such as ourselves to work with data providers. So in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we launched a report that was done in collaboration with Dun & Bradstreet, where we worked with them on access to a commercial data set that we use for sort of a public good model. And we're actually looking forward-looking to figuring out how we take that model and apply it to other commercial data sources to be able to have as a nonprofit to have access to those kind of data sources for sort of tech for good ideas. So that's an interesting thing we're doing on our own. And then to put on my not quite cold government hat back on. Talk about a couple of things that are happening. So in the academic space, I spent time at the National Science Foundation, and they are doing quite a bit to find ways to keep facilitating access to government, to academic research data in particular, and funding a bunch of different work related to data repositories and metadata and all the things that go into making all the federally funded research data available from the National Science Foundation, from the academic community. Another interesting thing that's happened in that particular arena is in the CHIPS and Science bill that passed recently. It in fact specified that NSF should create a national secure data service. And that's a really interesting example of a government activity is just going to get off the ground. And basically it's a way for all of the different administrative data in different parts of the government. Excuse me for that. For all of the different parts of the government. It could be the IRS. It could be CMS and other parts to provide data into a warehouse that then could be made available appropriately for research. So one could actually look at what is the interplay between, for example, federal financial assistance and future healthcare costs and things. Because surprisingly, we can't do that now. There's a huge data divide in that thing. So I think there's interest in that eventually also becoming a mechanism to combine other people's other commercial and other data sources as well. So there's definitely activity going on in this space. Chris, did you want to comment?
Well, no, I have to jump in on that one.
Yeah, please.
So when we're working on, like I said, with the University of Chicago Center for, Impact Science, as well as Atlantic Council, we love you all. That what we're looking at in that particular regard is the lack of what we're calling kind of the data ecosystem. So I think some of those aspects that you mentioned are great, where companies share their data, they do the project, but it's bespoke. It has a start and an end. And when you look at kind of the corporate sector with all these big refineries, and they've got a lot of negative issues that need to be solved around privacy and all that. However, bringing those big data sets together on an ongoing basis where you have ethics and privacy and security built in, I think is the, leapfrog to actually starting to solve the social and environmental challenges. And, the examples where we have seen, again, small nonprofits, and they get access to transportation data and health data, they're able to fundamentally change how they work in their communities. But again, we've got to move past that bespoke one time off. And I do think, government is, has to be a real leader in that for that ongoing basis too. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think building that larger ecosystem of this big data set, shared data, is really going to have significant impacts.
Yeah, essentially finding flexible frameworks that can be applied so that people don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel in doing this. Yes.
Yeah. And again, this start and end, like, oh, we did it here. It's like, well, no, we still, when it ends, we're still going to need the data to ensure we're, staying ahead of the challenges.
So if nobody else wants to jump in on that particular topic, Chris just raised another one, which is the whole issue of privacy, and how one incorporates privacy up front in discussing the data divide and open data and data sharing initiatives, and what's some of the work that's going on and that needs to be done.
Yeah, I'll go back to this notion of use case, when it comes to privacy. And understanding the industry that you're working in. Healthcare is a very different scenario, AI in healthcare, than how it's used in, say, a marketing optimization use case. So, understanding those compliance requirements, regulations are going to impact, how and what data you use, and the appropriate data that you should have access to. I think the good news is that, and it's somewhat related to the ecosystem comment that we made, is technology has come a really long way in helping manage and control access to data. I mean, now it's really easy to restrict access down to the field or attribute level, so that it's only made available to the humans or the systems that actually have the appropriate rights to it. And so I think that that's going to help a long way, and making sure that we actually use the power of technology in conjunction with the power of humans is really important as we address these problems for social good.
I think piggyback in, Michael stole my entire spiel. That's okay. I think also focused on that, one of the things that in conjunction with everything that he said was that data provenance is going to be something that we really need to focus on, right? So where is this data coming from? How do we use this data? How do we trust this data as we try to use it to make decisions? I think that was one of the things that came out of the report, is that we talked about it earlier, bad data in is bad data out. And we oftentimes don't know what this legacy data is, where it came from. And so I think in trying to understand the use case and trying to do a lot of sense making on the ground and understanding what the actual outcome is and why we need that outcome, we also need to understand the legacy data that is being inputted into that system, and how do we, are we sure we can trust it? And are we sure that the decisions being made on it are made in a way that's holistic for everyone else?
Yeah, so it isn't just about privacy, but also, again, trust and validation of data.
Yeah, and I will say one of the, again, coming more with my hat, but more maybe at kind of Tides, we're really embedded with civil society, and I think the importance of what they bring to everything. I will say what often I feel is missed in these discussions around privacy, because I feel we're experiencing like two camps sometimes right now. It's like, no data, everything's bad, like, on that end. And then they're like, data all the time. That we need to find the answer in the middle, but we need the engineers and the data scientists in the room, because I do think sometimes it is a technical challenge that, and back to Michael's point, can be solved if we're bringing the right, every time I talk with kind of the engineers, I learn something new every day at Splunk. And so it's, how do we unleash their work and their, commitments to this on a broader scale, because, they're doing it in their job. None of us would be in business unless we're doing that. And, but we still have a long way to go, I think, to get to this ecosystem data.
Having everyone in the room is a fantastic comment. I think that is very important. You need to have folks that understand the policy side, but also understand the technical side. AAAS does a fantastic fellowship. I'm going to just do a plug for that focuses on putting scientists and engineers in a policy realm, so that you can do both policy and a technical work to be able to do these things like solve public trust issues.
And there's an important development. I certainly know it from the federal side, and I know it's in companies as well. The concept of having a chief data officer separate from the CIO, and I think in some cases now that chief data officer has essentially a role as a chief privacy officer. That role, I think, should be properly implemented to have that person driving that issue that Chris just had, is making sure that you're getting the developers in the room at the same time in those conversations, so that you're not catching problems at the back end, and not mitigating problems, but actually building those solutions in up front. And I suspect that's happening at Splunk and Accenture. But I don't know if anyone wants to comment that. I knew, you're probably experiencing that a little bit, I know, within the government, Joe, but
yeah, it's definitely, again, we're in a corporate setting, like we have a whole privacy, security, it is embedded in what we do. I think I was just, our chief product officers publishing a blog, I think, this week around what we, have done around ethics into, the engineering side, and how, again, you're building it in. When you look at civil society and you look at government, they need the resources to do that also. And so again, it's making it equitable across the corporate, civil society, and government, that everybody can be on that same path.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to pipe in, but there's an interesting question in the chat. I think Joe, you may be typing an answer, but maybe we want to answer it. which is what was the most surprising finding or insight, or maybe generalize it. What are some of the more interesting things in your conversations with people, Joe, and maybe Solomon, you could potentially jump in since you're still here as well, as to what was surprising or from the conversations you had.
I think one of the most surprising things that I kind of saw was that people aren't as opposed to having their data being used as I thought they would be, right? I think Michael and I had a wonderful conversation about this. I think people are actually okay. As Chris mentioned earlier, there's two camps, right? Some that says no data and some that says data for all. But I'm starting to see that more people are on the data for all side than the no data side, but they're like data for all. But here's the asterisk. I want to understand I want to have control, and I want to be able to turn off my data if I want to turn off my data. It's not that you can just have it just to have it, but you can have it for this specific purpose at this specific time. And as Michael mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you have the right gatekeepers as you move through this data process with your data. And you want to be able to pull it back when you want to. Sometimes you might not want to share, how far you've walked today, or, something to that nature.
Yes, that goes back to the very beginning comments that I made about control. Yeah.
Right.
So I think so. I want to thank everybody. This has been a really great discussion, and I want to make sure we leave some time for our final speaker, who's going to make some concluding remarks, and that's John Goodman, who I'd like to introduce. John is the Chief Executive Officer of Accenture Federal Services, which serves clients across all sectors of the U.S. federal government: defense, intelligence, public safety, health, and civilian. Among his many impressive credentials, he served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and was on the staff at the National Economic Council at the White House. Perhaps most important to me, John is currently a co-chair of our GeoTech Center's Commission on the Geopolitical Impacts of New Technologies and Data. So it's always great to have an opportunity to occasionally talk to John on my own, which is always insightful. I'm going to pass this over to John, who see what he has to add to the conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lloyd. And since, Chris started off in her discussion, mentioned her connections to Stanford Business School. You left off the part how I started my career being on the faculty of Harvard Business School, or as we refer to it, the Stanford of the East. I want to start off, and I just want to thank the authors, Joe and Solomon. Data divide is a very complicated issue. I think their paper does an excellent job of clarifying the issues and providing actionable recommendations, which is the purpose of the Atlantic Council. And I think you've done a great service for all of those listening. It is also not a long paper. I would recommend it to everyone. I also want to thank Chris, Michael, and of course our new GeoTech Director, Lloyd Whitman. I think the conversation has really helped illuminate the issues, and particularly for what's a rather technical topic, the important social and political implications of the decisions that are being made. And in a few minutes in closing, I really wanted to focus on the government and the private sector and our roles. The U.S. government is increasingly seeking to make better use of data, to automate processes, to improve decision making, doing everything from processing veteran claims, reducing fraud, locating and planning for future forest fires, and identifying and countering Russian disinformation campaigns. And as the study notes, how the government uses data, particularly when it involves PII, will also have significant implications for the trust Americans have in their government. And I think this is particularly important because trust in government is a key foundation of democracy. So there's a lot at stake here. Now, I'm confident we can get the technical part of this right. What I'm personally more concerned about is the human factor. And I think a lot of responsibility for action there falls on the private sector, because we have the capability, the means, and frankly, we use and engage with so many people and employees that action is particularly important. Because it's important that companies such as ours not only train people with skills in data science and data engineering, but also on the ethical uses of that data. And second, and this is a point that the discussion touched upon, but I just want to close my comment reinforcing it. It's also the responsibility of the private sector to build inclusive and diverse workforces, whether in all forms. And for example, in my business, we're increasingly focused on hiring apprentices in training without four-year degrees to be able to expand not just job access, but points of view that will help us remain innovative. It's important for us to build inclusive and diverse workforces because our own policies and practices and how we build, train our organization will help increase awareness and responsiveness to addressing the data issues that this panel has done such a great job addressing. So thank you all very much. Lloyd, back to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. One of my favorite descriptions is, if you look under the table and everyone's wearing the same kind of shoes, you have a problem. Unfortunately, that's not practical today. I can ask everybody to raise their feet up. So anyway, that's a great way to close. I want to thank you, John. I want to thank Joe and Solomon for your work on the report, Chris, Michael, and John again for your participation today. I'd also like to thank the Atlantic Council's event team for their excellent AV support. And finally, thanks to everyone who joined us today, and have a great day.